Hello and welcome to the She Force Show. I'm your host, Amy Carlson. Today I have my friend Sonya Sigler, the founder of PractiGal. Welcome, Sonya.
Thank you, Amy. I'm so happy to be here with you.
I have been looking forward to this. I know we have a very special topic to talk about today, but before we dive into that, can you share a little more about PractiGal and what it is, how you got going, and what it is you do?
Yeah, so I've been a lawyer for 30 years, and about the last 20 of that, I've been working with startups. And one of the things I discovered is I really like helping the CEOs, like personally and professionally. So in 2018, I started my own company to do consulting and coaching. So combine the two methods to help people really move forward, whether it's personally or professionally in the business that they're building.
Nice. And I love the name.
Well, I am all about practical advice. So
And
that's
how
how it came out. And that was probably, oh my gosh, almost 20 years ago.
cool. And that's what spoke to me is like, there's really that pragmatic part of me, that efficient part of me that, and when I see that in writing there, I'm like, yeah, yes, I want that. And
Excellent.
today, so this whole we could spend a whole other episode, which we may need to at some point, talking about how the transition from being a lawyer into what you're doing now, which is amazing. And I also know that what you are going to speak to today and talk more about is a passion of yours and something that you have also written a book about along the lines of self-care.
I might actually call it self-preservation from being a lawyer to being a consultant because self-care was something I didn't do. And I'll just tell you a little bit. I ended up in the hospital 2 days before I turned 35, thinking I was having a heart attack. And so that's where my focus on self-care started. And then later getting divorced is I really was like, I had come from such a negative environment that I really needed to make some changes. And so self-care has kind of become like a, I don't know, personal anthem, if you will. So it kind of underlies everything that I do. So the coaching and consulting that I do through PractiGal is really focused on what makes you thrive, not just professionally, but personally, and then really building those things into your life. So I have a whole series of books. This was the self-care one is the first on building your intentional life. And how do you do that instead of being on autopilot?
Absolutely. That kind of default
Mhm.
living that I think so often we go along with until we have those shake up moments, which I'm sure living in the hospital like you did was a big one of those. Yeah.
It was kind of wild. My son was 10 months old. My other two kids were almost 2 and 3.5. And I had been experiencing some issues and I felt like I couldn't get my breath and like someone was sitting on my chest and no matter what I did. And I walked my kids to school. So I'd put the little one in the backpack and hold the other two hands and we walked, it was a mile downhill. And then I'd walk up back uphill with the other one on my back still. And it was a great way to get exercise. But then I'd be like so winded. I could barely walk to the mailbox and back, which was like just at the end of the driveway. And so I remember taking my son to the Giants game and we caught the train and took it up to San Francisco and I was running up the stairs to catch the train and I felt like I literally didn't have the fuel in my body to get to the train. And they're like, come on, come on. And I get on there and I was just like, oh my God, I need to sit down. And so it was like a series of these things that kept happening over the 10-month period since he was born. And then I just ended up in the hospital. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest. And, that was kind of the first wake up call. It wasn't a heart attack. It was an overactive thyroid that was so out of whack that that's what it felt like. But all these symptoms had been masked by postpartum. So all of those symptoms are very similar. And so I just didn't know. And so when I got into the hospital and they're like, this test came out fine, this test came out fine, like everything was fine. And I'm like, well, I am not fine. Like something is going on here. And so it was another few days. They let me go home. They put like, I don't know, 2, 3 bags of saline in me. So I was severely dehydrated. And um, sent me home, said, oh, we'll have the thyroid test in a couple of days. Well, it turns out it was so overactive. Like, they're like, how are you even alive? Like, that heart beating out of your chest is really what kills people, kills women specifically, is because they don't know they have an overactive thyroid. So it was all these kind of clues. I didn't make all the changes then. It took another health incident later. I don't need to bore you with all the details. Let's just say I kept going, and it was another 5 years later, maybe 4 years later, before I figured out, okay, I need to make some serious changes. So I started with like yoga, and I started with getting massages. So like all the things you think of self-care, but I didn't really make the lifestyle changes. And I'll talk more about the details about that. I didn't really make those until I got divorced and moved out in 2013, beginning of 2013. And one of the things that struck me is, and I mentioned the negativity earlier, is if you wouldn't say that to your best friend, why are you saying it to yourself? So it took a lot of just reflection and a lot of hearing the voice in my head to be like, whoa, Nellie, like, and recognizing it as my dad's voice and his dad's voice, and being like, why am I letting their voices live in my head and being negative to me? So I really was like, oh, I need to start speaking to myself in a kinder voice. And so that, I think, was the start of really just changing how I functioned in the world. And at the time, I was in a more than full-time job, commuting to San Francisco. And so it was just like, what do I want in my life? What can I get rid of that's negative? And so I literally stopped spending time with people who were negative. And I literally stopped listening to the news. So those two things were, it's not that I didn't get any news. I just stopped listening to the news, and the negativity level went way down. So that, just being kinder to myself in those two ways, was hugely helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And what just struck me too is, in a sense, they're both like audible ways, right? Where we're being inundated by negativity from the news, etc. And also that voice in our head that just, again, speaking of, living by default, there's just a pattern there that sometimes we don't even realize is so active.
Yeah, I think being on my own, living on my own, and not in my first marriage, um, it was a respite to be able to hear that and to be like, oh, wow, I don't need to be that negative. Like, the world is not a negative place. It can be, but I mean, the message of love makes the world go round really kind of took hold at that point in time. I was kind of running on a daily basis, and when you run, you get into this meditative state. And I was just like, wow, that was pretty negative. And so what I started doing was right away rephrasing it to something positive, even if it is you're running and taking care of it, like literally a fact. Like, so that was one thing I was like, okay. And then one day I was out running and I had this epiphany, and it was just like, oh, I've been acting out of fear for so long. I don't know how to act out of love. I really need to just do that first. Like, what's the next kindest, most loving thing I can do for myself? And going from that. And let me tell you, as a lawyer, that is not your first thought. You're that is not your first thought. And now it serves me and my clients better to be able, like, what is the next most loving thing I can do for you, that we can do for you? Like, it's just a very different mindset. And so I think that epiphany forced me to retrain my thinking and retrain me in terms of my actions. And I would say that's a work in progress. I'm still in the middle of, 10 plus years later.
Yeah. I love that question that you pose to yourself and the regular that you use with clients. That's absolutely beautiful. And so what does self-care, self-preservation, self-thriving, fill in the blank? What does that look like for you now?
I think before I get into the specifics of what it looks like for me now, I want to say the underlying philosophy is to know yourself and what it takes for you to thrive. Because if you don't know that, you're going to be trying on all these things. So remember, I mentioned the spa kind of massage and yoga. That may not work for you. It works for me because I love it and I feel like I take care of my body and I can balance it. Um, but if you don't know what it takes for you to thrive, like you don't know yourself well enough to know that, that's where you got to start. So that's what I've kind of recreated over the last, I'm going to say 11 years since 2013. And knowing what works for me and what doesn't was really important. So I'll give you a couple examples. I talked about the self-talk, like being able to change that as I go along. But other things were like, what does it take for my body to be healthy? I was commuting, I was traveling a ton for work. Well, what happens when you travel for work? You go out with the sales guys, you eat a lot of food, you drink a lot, like things that aren't necessarily the best for you. And so I started eating like 2 appetizers and instead of like a appetizer and a whole meal. So I just shrunk the amount of food. I started eating healthy whole foods instead of processed foods. I subscribed to a farm share. So I just made some changes. I would say incremental. Like you can't try everything wholesale all at once. That's like a recipe for failure or disaster or feeling like a failure. So I just kind of did one change at a time. And so the running helped, the food change helped, the um, changed while I was traveling. So I was running while I was traveling. So I've been known to FedEx my tennis shoes home from a conference. So there's some things like that that I just kind of put in place to help incrementally, and all of them kind of added up to be like, oh, I'm healthy, I've got good strength, I eat well, um, and at the same time, just that continuous negative voice, like fixing that, retraining it. And I would say the retraining is a continuous effort. And until it becomes the default mechanism, you're going to continually retrain your brain. So I think that has been eye-opening in terms of seeing other people around me in that negative state and being like, wow, okay, now I can spot it better. Um, and that's what I do with people in terms of helping them on a coaching and consulting basis, is really helping them like get in the right mindset. If you're transitioning to start your own business, um, or start your own law firm, whatever you're starting, that takes a lot of resilience and a lot of stick to itiveness and positivity of I'm doing the right thing. So that continuous um, acting out of love, being positive, taking care of yourself, all of those things are an incremental step that you can take. So that's kind of how I have looked at it philosophically in terms of really what is self-care for me now. Um, Now I'm an empty nester, so I don't have 3 boys at home eating me out of house and home. I remarried to a really positive, kind man. And so those 2 changes have really helped me just be able to be like, oh, how do I want my life? How do I want to live my life? As opposed to being on a treadmill and being I'm feeling like on a hamster wheel of like, uh, oh, I have to do this, or oh, I should do this. Like that have to and should, those were things I've kind of put to the wayside. I got laid off in 2014 and I had to make a choice of do I keep looking for a full-time job, or what I ended up deciding was no, I need to consult because, and I just made a mind map of this whole thing. How do I want to spend my time? My boys were about to head off to college. Um, I had like 2 more years with my oldest, and then 3 more years with my next, and then 5 years with the youngest. And so I was like, okay, over the next 5 years, how do I want to live my life with these boys? How do I want to shape them into the men that they're going to become? So I wanted some one-on-one time with each of them. I knew they were going to college, so I'm like, okay, I need a high-paying job that or consulting that I can handle those expenses. I was paying for both houses and lifestyles at the time, so I was like, how do I support this? I wanted to travel and see my friends because I had been so isolated um, for so long and I didn't even know it. I wanted to spend time with my family. So how do I build those things in? So I kind of sat down and I was like, wow, I want to spend the weekend with my family, or I want one-on-one time with my boys. How am I going to fit all these things in? And I was the photographer for their team, sports teams. So how can I be at the football field on Fridays at 4 to take pictures? How can I, like basketball, like how can I fit all this in? And I was like, oh, I really need to consult instead of finding a full-time job with an hour-long commute each way. And so that change, I have not one of the things I put in place was I'm not working on Fridays. So it's been 10 years of not working on Fridays.
Yay, good for you.
That was one of the big changes I put in place. So I didn't have to do all of the errands and that's kind of stuff on the weekends. I did that on Fridays. Or I did something fun like go to the museum with my mom, or I met a friend for lunch, or just some of those things that really gave me energy instead of the things that like suck the living daylights out of me, like commuting to San Francisco for an hour each way. So that mindset shift of what energizes you versus what sucks the energy out of you, that was the other thing that really made a difference in self-care. So if I could define it for me now, it's like know yourself and what it takes for you to thrive. So that essence is really the message of the book I just published, 30 Days to Better Self-Care. It's really the essence of what I do with people now to help them thrive personally and professionally. It's really, it's what I do in my relationship with my husband. Like, how do we want to live our lives? So it's really figuring out what works for you and what makes you thrive. So that has been a huge change.
Absolutely. And it just, okay, for those of you who are watching the video, you can just tell that Sonya is thriving. And for those of you listening to the audio, just trust me, she is glowing and thriving. And what I hear you say in your message and what feels super consistent all the way through is prioritizing. That self-care has a lot to do with knowing your priorities and honoring those. And that just created a light bulb moment for me. We hear so much commercially about self-care and the media is talking about it. And I feel like there can be confusion or somewhat of a like maybe it's just confusion, but the way you just described all of this, that's what I really got out of it. And how you work with people is to know themselves so that they can prioritize. And that is like the ultimate way to thrive.
Yeah, Amy, I think, and I've got another book that's in a series of PractiGal career mentor series. I've got two books, Welcome to the Next Level and What's Next for My Career. The third one is Set Yourself Up for Success. And in interviewing over 30 people for that book, one of the things that came out as one of the top 5 skills to succeed in any job is self-care. And what it comes down to is boundary setting and keeping. So those things that you called priorities, that's really the boundary that you're going to keep for yourself for you to thrive. And so knowing yourself helps you be able to define the boundary and then keep it. And then act in alignment. So I called it, how do you act out of love instead of fear? It's really how are you in alignment with your own priorities? Because when we get out of alignment with those things and we're on autopilot and we forget, oh, I really wanted to spend, July 4th weekend with my family camping versus how did I get roped into redoing these bylaws and articles of incorporation, on Wednesday night. So I think every choice is guided by that set of priorities and that behavior can follow. And for me, I had 0 boundaries. I'm just going to work. I was a workaholic. I was like, I don't want to get fired from my job as a lawyer. And that fear permeates professionally. I don't like in the legal profession, and I see other professions like that, especially with entrepreneurs. If I don't do this, my company's not going to succeed. And so I just keep pushing, pushing, pushing until we hit that wall, like I did, and ended up in the emergency room, not just once, but twice. um, it, it it took me a long time to hear that it's my priority and my boundary to keep and set, or to set and keep. um, that I think if anyone listening to this can walk away with is, it's my job to understand myself and where that boundary is for me and how I keep it. That I think is the key to ultimate self-care and being able to thrive.
That is beautiful. I love that message. And we will have all of the information right alongside this so that you can access any of Sonya's books, how to get in touch with her to just stay in her world. Is there anything else that you would like to add to our conversation here, or anything we didn't get to chat about yet?
I think we could spend days chatting about self-care and what it looks like for you versus what it looks like for me, because it's unique to you. So there's no easy button here. There's no magic pill. There's no little checklist I can give you that's going to be right for you. So I can give you topics, which is really what 30 Days to Better Self-Care became. So let me just show it there. 30 Days to Better Self-Care is more like a workbook for you to figure out what works for you and discard what doesn't. And so when I say what's an energy inspirational thing for you, like me, time in the garden is that way for me. Other people might be like, I talked to a client last week. She's like, yeah, I really don't like gardening. I'm like, well, then don't put it on your list. Like, take it off. Like, no one said you had to. So it was really that mindset of what works for you and figuring that out. So I think if you walk away with anything, it's figure out what, knowing yourself and what it takes for you to thrive. So figuring out those key little things, just takes time, and it's one step at a time. It's not a wholesale change today by going to the spa or taking a yoga class, or those might all be good. I literally have a list in my notebook of the things that energize me, and so I'm like, oh, I feel like worn down. Let me just do one of those things, and it might be 15 minutes of walking outside, like in the sun, like nature, whatever. So knowing what those are for you, I think it is really great. The only other thing I'll say is, if you do want to connect with me, please check me out on LinkedIn. I've written self-care articles on there and they're all posted. So Sonya Sigler on LinkedIn and sonyasigler.com to find me and the work that I do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And this, just as you ended things right there, it ties right in with the little mantra that we have at SheForce: know yourself, be yourself, and free yourself. Sonya, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate you having me on.